If you had to guess, how many languages would you say are spoken on planet Earth? 100? 500? 1,000? This may seem hard to believe, but there are currently over 7,000 languages spoken on planet Earth. Those 7,000 languages are in some ways bewilderingly different. But it turns out they also have an awful lot in common. So what unifies human languages? It turns out that it's a computational property that they all share. A computational property related to structure. Let's think about this another way. Let me ask you a question. What do you know when you know a language? This question on the surface seems like it should be very easy to answer. We all know a language, we speak a language, we use it frequently, probably every day. It seems like we should have a really good grasp on what we know about the languages that we speak. But it turns out that it's very hard for us to introspect about what we know. So what do you know when you know a language? Well, you know what sequences of sounds can be strung together to make a valid word. You know that a sequence like blick would be a valid word in English, but something like bnick probably wouldn't be. It probably doesn't sound right. You also know what sequences of words will make a valid sentence. If I said the cat slept on the mat, you would say, yeah, that sounds like a perfectly valid sentence of English. But if I said the cat mat slept on, that doesn't really sound right. Or cat the mat the on slept sounds even worse. Or cat mat slept on the sounds outright terrible. It's not enough to just have the right words, they have to go in the right order. We also know what words and sentences mean. When someone says something, we know what they're talking about. So all of these things have to sort of come together to constitute our knowledge of the language that we speak. Language is all about rules and structure, and there are layers and layers of structure. There are rules for combining sounds into syllables. There are rules for combining syllables into words. There are rules for combining words into phrases and phrases into sentences, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And each domain has its own rules and its own kind of structure. We're going to zoom in first. We're going to start with patterns of sounds. How do we combine sounds into words? What makes a valid word? Well, first of all, every language has an inventory of sounds. It's sort of like a toolbox of all the sounds you have access to that you can use to build words. How many unique sounds does English have? Maybe more than you think. English has 24 consonants, which is fairly high among world languages, although not the highest. And we have somewhere between 10 and 12 vowels, which is extremely high in the context of world languages. Although this varies by dialect. As a personal example, my dialect has fewer vowels than the average person who lives on the East Coast, because my dialect has merged a couple of them together into a single sound. So your dialect may have more vowels than mine. Some dialects in the UK will have more vowels than any of us. And languages can really vary in terms of how many sounds they have available in their toolbox. If we're talking about consonants, this can range from a low of only 6 in a language called Rotokas, spoken in Papua New Guinea, to a high of 122 consonants. This is a feature of the language Ko, which is spoken in Botswana and parts of Namibia. The reason that number gets so high is they have a category of sounds that most languages on Earth don't even have. Non-pulmonic consonants, the so-called clicks. Adding clicks to an inventory can really explode the number of consonants that you can get out of your vocal apparatus. If we're talking about vowels, the range is a little bit less extreme. There are at least 4 languages in the world that have only 2 vowels, and that might seem kind of weird from our perspective speaking English, where we have somewhere between 10 and 12 vowels. But there are at least 4 languages with only 2 vowels. I know of Yimas in Papua New Guinea and Abkhaz in the Caucasus Mountains. Both have vowel systems that only consist of 2 vowels, a high vowel and a low vowel, something like I and A. The highest vowel count in the world is actually German, with 14 vowels. So you might notice this range is a lot smaller, only from 2 to 14 rather than 6 to 122. You might also notice that English is on the upper end of this, with somewhere around 11, 12 vowels, second really only to German with 14. Okay, so languages vary. They have different tool sets, have different sounds available. But what do they do with them? How do they string them together to form words? Well, recall back to when we talked about computational machinery. Remember the Chomsky hierarchy. Our boy, Noam Chomsky, came up with this hierarchy for charting computational complexity, which is operationalized in terms of specific kinds of computational machines, the machines that are required to process or compute the types of structures found at each level of the hierarchy. Well, it turns out languages have different kinds of rules governing what kinds of sounds can appear in what order to form words, and those rules appear at a few very specific levels of that complexity hierarchy. So all the sound patterns of all the world's languages are going to fall under the regular region. That's the region that can be computed by finite state machines. But it turns out we can actually subdivide that lowest region even further. And it's only some sub-areas of the regular region that describe the sound patterns that we see in world languages. So the patterns that we see are actually even simpler than you might have thought, even simpler than regular languages in general, occupying only a subspace of that region. Okay, so let's think about how we might do this in English. How do you make a valid word in English? English is a pretty flexible language in the sense that there are a lot of ways that you can make a word. There are a lot of ways that a word can start. Pla, bra, ska, stra, skla, skra, thra, pwa, squa. So there are lots of possible combinations for the beginnings of words. But there are definitely certain kinds of combinations that are not going to work for us. Think about a word like tlack, or zrap, or tik. Might sound a bit odd. I don't think I know any English words that start with those sequence of sounds. And they're not unpronounceable. I can pronounce them. It might feel weird to me because I'm not used to it, but I can pronounce them. They're not physically impossible. But they do violate the rules of English. English has some kind of rules about what sounds can go in what order at the beginning of a word. And those rules say you can't start a word with tla, or zra, or pta. It just doesn't feel right. And it's not the combination of those things that's the problem. It's totally fine to have a T and an L in combination as long as it's not at the beginning of a word. So you can think of a word like potluck. Oh yeah, I've got a T and then an L following it. Or Israel, zra, or uptick. It's got a P and then a ta. The important thing is that it's not at the beginning of a word. Okay, so how can we categorize these kinds of rules that say you can't have this following that at the beginning of a word? Well, it turns out these rules are very, very simple. They only operate from one sound to the next sound to the next sound. They are strictly local. We call them strictly local because they're operating just from one sound to the next adjacent sound. And this is an incredibly simple kind of rule that it turns out can be processed with finite state machines. And specifically, we can use finite state machines operating over strings of sounds or strings of symbols. Here's another example of a strictly local rule in English. English has a process that we call nasal place assimilation. Well, what's nasal place assimilation? Well, we have certain sounds in our inventory in English called nasals. Sounds like N and M. They're nasal because when we make them, we open up the nasal passageway and air flows through our nose and out our nostrils. They're nasal sounds. And there's an interesting rule here where if you take a prefix like, say, in, in, and you put it in front of a word, you can have a word like possible. Something can be possible. It can also be impossible. Well, that's a bit weird because that prefix is actually in with an N. But when we put it in front of possible, it becomes impossible. Well, what's happening? What's causing that change? Well, the nasal sound in that prefix is assimilating to the sound that follows it. It is becoming more like that sound that follows it. That's why we call this nasal place assimilation. And that's another example of a strictly local rule. It's just looking from one sound to the immediately next adjacent sound. A very, very simple kind of rule that you can compute with finite state machines operating over strings. Well, that's English. What about other languages? Are there other kinds of rules that are maybe more interesting or more complex? Well, let's take an interesting example. Chumash is a language spoken in California. It's a language spoken by an indigenous population that lives on the California coast. Chumash has a really interesting rule that's not found in too many other languages. It's certainly not found in English. In Chumash, a word cannot have both s and sh, s and esh. And it doesn't matter how far apart those two sounds are in the word, if it's one's at the beginning and the other's at the end. If you're a Chumash speaker, you have to look across the entire word and say, well, there's an s at the beginning. I better not find an esh anywhere else in that entire word. So while the English rules are local, you're always looking from one sound to the next immediately adjacent sound, this rule is actually long distance. It doesn't care how far apart those sounds are. They can be any distance in the word. And in fact, there's an example of a really long word that has eshes at both ends. There's a Chumash word, shtoyo no wonawash, and it means something like, it stood upright. And you might notice there's esh at the beginning and there's esh at the end. Those two things have to agree with each other, even though they are a very long distance from each other. Well, it turns out this rule can also be computed by finite state machines, but only if you're using a different kind of representation. You have to use sequences instead of strings. And what's a sequence? Well, basically a sequence is extracting out those things you care about from the entire word and then looking at just those things in a row. So what we care about in a word like shtoyo no wonawash is whether there's an esh somewhere in the word following the first one. So what we do is we pull out all the eshes, all of those sh sounds, and we look at them in a sequence and we say, okay, if I look at just all of those, am I going to find an s snuck in there somewhere? And the answer in this case is no. So we're okay. This word is legal. If the word had been stoyo no wonawash, we pull out all of those s and esh type sounds, we put them in a row, we would see, oh no, I've got an s and an esh. That's no good. So it's a very different kind of representation. Instead of looking at every sound, we're only going to look at a certain category of sound in a sequence. But we can still process it with the same kind of machinery, just with a different kind of representation. We can also maybe imagine a rule that says something like, if the first sound in a word is s, then the last sound in the word also has to be s. Or if the first sound is esh, then the last sound has to be esh. So maybe we don't care about what's going on in the middle of the word, we just want to know if the very first sound and the very last sound agree with each other. Well, it turns out this rule is slightly more complex than the English rules, and it's slightly more complex even than the Chumash rules. This resides in a region that actually sits above strictly local and strictly piecewise, the sequence rules, called the non-counting region. It's still regular. It still lives under that umbrella of the regular region. But it's above the English and Chumash rules. These rules turn out to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to learn. So that tells us something really interesting about the way that our minds are organized for the purpose of performing computations related to language. The set of computations that our minds can execute in this domain, in the domain of sound patterns, it's actually highly restricted to just a few of the very lowest levels on the complexity hierarchy. It doesn't even occupy the full scope of the regular region. It's only a few subparts of that region that describe all of the patterns that we see in all the world's languages in terms of sounds, in terms of what sequence of sounds can make a valid word. So words have a kind of structure, but it's a really simple structure. It's local, it's all about strings and sequences, but I want to move up a level now and look at how we combine words to make sentences. What do the rules for creating sentences look like? How does that process work? What is it that we know that allows us to produce well-formed sentences? One important property that our computational machinery for generating sentences has is an element of recursion. When the output of a rule can be used as the input for another application of the same rule. Or sometimes you get a big recursive loop where the output of one rule is fed as the input to another rule, and the output of that rule is fed back as the input to the previous rule. So how do we capture our infinite ability in light of our finite brains? This recursive property is crucial. This is how we can get infinitely long possible strings. This is how we can get infinitely long possible sentences. Even though we couldn't actually produce an infinitely long sentence, we have the machinery capable of doing so. Take an example like this. I can say a very simple sentence like, Dana saw a fox. And I can add some content. I can say, Dana saw a fox at the movies. Maybe I'll add a little more. Dana saw a fox at the movies with his mother. Maybe I'll add some stuff to the front. Walter told Alex that Dana saw a fox at the movies with his mother. I can add a little more. Fox knows that Walter told Alex that Dana saw a fox. This is exactly like the house that Jack built. I could just keep adding and keep iterating because of that recursive property of language. So this embedding illustrates that recursive property. This was first formulated by Noam Chomsky in 1957 when he wrote Syntactic Structures. This is part of what makes syntactic structures so influential even today. In a nutshell, generative linguistics is all about this idea that we have this highly productive computational machinery that includes this element of recursion that can generate infinitely many sentences. The fact that we can produce infinitely many sentences from our apparently finite minds, sometimes referred to as the finite infinite puzzle. Language itself is very finite in some sense. We only have finite many atomic units to work with. We have that inventory of sounds. We don't have infinite numbers of sounds. We only have a finite number of words. We don't have infinite words. And we only have finite many ways to combine them. And yet somehow from that we can produce infinitely many sentences. I want to shift now and talk more specifically about the type of structure that we see in sentences. And the structure that we see, this is, I think, the single most important aspect, the single most important property of human language that ties everything together, is that sentences are hierarchically structured. So I want to talk about an example that makes the hierarchical structure of language really apparent. And it will showcase, I think, why we want to view sentences in hierarchical terms. Suppose I say to you, John saw the elk with the binoculars. Like I run in, I'm like, you're never going to believe John saw an elk with binoculars. Okay, what does that sentence actually mean? It turns out that it's ambiguous, right? John saw the elk with binoculars? Well, wait, who has binoculars? I mean, it would make a lot of sense, I guess, if John has the binoculars and he's seeing an elk through the binoculars. But it's at least also possible that John saw an elk that had binoculars. Now, maybe if I'm really excited when I say this, maybe you think like, maybe that is what happened because it would be really noteworthy, right? But we can't know just from the sentence itself. So what we have here is we have a sentence that consists of certain words in a certain order, but that same sentence, that same string of words, maps to two very different meanings. So here's the question, how can we model that fact? How can we capture the fact that a single string of words in the same order, the same words in the same order, can have two really different meanings? And it's not any of the words that has two meanings here. Every word is being used in the same way in both sentences. None of these words are ambiguous. John can only refer to one person named John. Seeing, we know what seeing is with your eyes. An elk is an animal. Binoculars are a thing you see with. So what gives? How do we get those two meanings from this same string of words? This is why we need structure. It turns out there are actually two different structures that can map to this same string. So although the sentences that come out of our mouths are strings in a very real sense, we can't articulate a structure in the way that syntacticians draw them like a tree. We have to say words one at a time. That's a restriction imposed on us by physics. But even though that's true that we are producing strings of words in the physical sense, What we're trying to recreate in our minds is a tree structure. We're trying to recreate a hierarchical mental representation. Because the hierarchical mental representation is what the other speaker had in their mind that caused them to utter the sentence that they uttered. What we're trying to do as listeners is reconstruct what that hierarchical mental representation was that caused them to say this string of words in this order. That's why this is a problem, because here we have a string of words that maps to two different hierarchical structures. We have to choose one or the other. We can't know ahead of time which one is right. So how do these different structures actually encode those different meanings? Well, we can draw the two trees, and what we see is where the phrases connect to each other. That's what tells us what's actually happening in this scenario. In linguistics, modification happens between sisters, between nodes that are at the same level. So if we look at the prepositional phrase with the binoculars, what we want to know is, what is it a sister to? What is its sister node? Well, if its sister node is elk, elk with the binoculars, that means the elk is the one that has the binoculars, the elk with the binoculars. But what if the sister node of the prepositional phrase, the sister node of with the binoculars, is the entire verb phrase, saw the elk? The event of seeing the elk is the thing that occurred with the binoculars. Well, in that case, John is the one with the binoculars because John's the one doing the seeing. It's the event itself that's being modified by the binoculars. So those two different tree structures give us a really clear way to model those two very different meanings. And this is what's going on in our heads when we hear a sentence like this. We're trying to reconstruct one of those tree structures or the other, and we sort of have to hope that we're right. I have another example to highlight the need for hierarchical structure. Suppose you're in class and you want a piece of gum, but you forgot to bring some. So you turn to the person next to you and say, "Hey, you have any gum?" What would be an acceptable response to that question? Well, if I don't have any gum, I can say, "No, I don't have any gum. Sorry." But what if I do? Can I say, "Yes, I do have any gum"? "Hey, do you have any gum?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do have any gum." Does that sound right? Probably not. That probably sounds really weird. Why? Why is that so weird? I mean, if you can ask me if I have any gum, shouldn't I be able to say, "Yes, I do have any gum"? Why can't I just repeat back what you said to me? Well, it turns out there's a rule in English that says, yeah, a word like anybody, you can't just say that like whenever you feel like it. You have to say it in very specific contexts. One context where you can use anybody is when there's negation, when you have not in the sentence. That's why I can say, "I don't have any gum." I do not have any gum. But I can't say, "I do have any gum." That sounds really weird. That's why these are called negative polarity items. They have to go with negation. They have to go with a negative. So I can't say something like, "The book I bought appealed to anybody." Sounds pretty weird. But I could say, "The book I bought didn't appeal to anybody." That's fine. And if we were to try to come up with a rule to explain what's going on here, we might say, oh, well, it looks like you have to have some kind of negation preceding the anybody. That seems like a viable rule to explain the pattern that we see here. But there's a problem with this. And that problem is that if we just want the negation to precede anybody, well, then we should be able to say something like, "The book I did not buy appealed to anybody." The negation is in front of anybody. It comes before it in the sentence. But it doesn't work. Why does that not work? Well, it's not good enough to just say it precedes the negative polarity item. It's not enough to just have negation preceding anybody. What we care about here is not the linear relationship in that string of words. What we care about is the structure. That's why we can have a situation where negation is preceding anybody, but it still doesn't seem to do the job because it's not in the right structural relationship. What is that structural relationship? Well, this is something Noam Chomsky came up with decades ago. It's one of the most important structural relationships in syntax. It's called C-command. And my shorthand for what C-command is, you can think of it as, you're in the tree structure. If you start at the thing that's C-commanding something else, if you go up one level and then down. If the thing that you're supposed to C command is in that domain, then you're good. If it's not in that domain, then it's not good. So what is C command? C command is everything, if you go up one level then down, all of that stuff is being C commanded. So if we look at the tree for the book I bought did not appeal to anybody, you start at the negative, you start at not. You go up one level and then down, and you find anybody in that circle. Great, that's perfect. Anybody is being C commanded by the negation. Well, what if we look at the book I did not buy appealed to anybody? In this structure, if we start at the negative, we start at not, we go up one and then down. Ooh, anybody's not in here. It's not in the circle. That's no good. That means anybody's no longer being C commanded by the negation. So that violates our structural rule, even though it would satisfy a much simpler linear rule. And that's evidence we have that linear rules just aren't good enough to describe the patterns that we see in syntax. You need structure. And it turns out this hierarchical structure is a very deep property of human language. It's something that every language shares. And all languages seem to be equally complex in this domain. So hierarchical structure isn't just convenient, it's necessary to model the types of sentences that we can actually produce. But then, how complex are the computations involved in creating sentences? How complex are sentences anyway? We've already seen the rules for generating valid words are very, very simple, well within the regular region. Well, what about sentences? How complex are these computations? Well, let's take a simple recursive sentence of the type that we saw in the house that Jack built. Something like, John said that, Mary said that, Joan said that, Bill said that, Owen said that, da-da-da-da-da. You can do this forever and ever and ever. Well, it turns out that this type of sentence is also a regular structure. It can be computed with finite state machines. It's a very, very simple structure. It doesn't require any memory. And this is why we can produce these sentences infinitely. We can just keep generating more and more and more structure without any real added difficulty, because they don't require any memory. That's why finite state machines can process them. So we have a finite state machine that looks like this. We have three states. We output a subject, John. We output a verb, said. Then we can loop back with a that connects us to a new sentence. We get another iteration, and we can go around the carousel. John said that. Mary said that. Joan said that. At some point, of course, we can produce an actual sentence. John said that, Mary said that, Joan left the party, or whatever. And we can exit that finite state machine. Or we can just keep looping around forever and ever and ever. So just like the rules for generating valid words, at least certain kinds of sentences can also be computed with similarly simple machinery. Some languages are going to do this a little differently, though. So instead of this pattern of subject, verb, subject, verb, subject, verb, some languages have to do subject, 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 verb, verb, verb. The problem with that is that you need to have the same number of subjects and verbs, but you gotta wait until you get all your subjects before you do all your verbs. Maybe this doesn't seem like a very big problem, but for a finite state machine, this is a huge problem because it requires memory. You have to remember how many subjects there were by the time you get to the verbs so that you can have the same number of verbs as you have subjects. This requires memory. Finite state machines just cannot do this. We need to introduce memory, at least a very limited kind of memory, such as the push-down stack. So if you remember we talked previously, the context-free region that's above the regular region, the complexity hierarchy, requires memory in the form of push-down stack. So we can actually compute something like this, SSS, VVV, subject, 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 verb, 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 with something that looks like a finite state machine. We've got two states. Each one has a loop, a subject loop and then a verb loop. The problem with this finite state machine is that you can do the subject loop as many times as you want, but then when you go to the second state, you will have no memory of how many times you went through that loop. The finite state machine does not keep track of how you got to a particular state. It does not know. So you won't know how many times you should go through that verb loop. That's why we need pushdown. Pushdown gives us a way of keeping track of how many times we outputted a subject, so that when we go to output verbs, for each verb we output, we can take one of those memory bits off the stack that corresponds to each subject. So you build the stack up for subjects, then you take it down for verbs. And if you end in 0, if you end with 0 things in the stack, then you've done it successfully. You have equal numbers of subjects and verbs. So this can be done with a computational machine that looks like a finite state machine, but we're going to have to add memory. Incidentally, humans don't have infinite memory, so this becomes a little bit difficult for us. English also has structures like this, right? We can have a sentence like, the rat the cat chased fell. That should sound pretty okay, right? It's kind of a reduced relative, but I think it's something we say pretty frequently. The rat the cat chased fell. Well, what happens if we repeat that loop more than once, right? This is a recursive structure, so at least in principle, we should be able to generate as many levels of this embedding as we want. The rat, the cat, the dog bit, chased, fell. That doesn't feel quite so good anymore, huh? When I hear that, my brain kind of crashes. I don't know about you. Maybe this sounds okay to you. We could add more. Everyone's going to crash at some point. There is definitely an upper limit to how many of these embeddings you can comprehend. That's true for all of us. We only have finite memory. And some of us maybe have much more limited memory than others, so I have a particularly hard time with this. I can't do more than 1 or 2 levels of this kind of embedding before my brain completely crashes. There are certain things we can do to ameliorate this if we balance the prosody, if we make it sound better, but there is always going to be an upper limit to how many of these levels of embedding we can get away with. And that has to do with the fact that it requires memory. It's just not quite as simple as adding something to the front of a sentence like the house that Jack built. It's not quite as simple as making words with longer and longer strings. So that underlying property that ties languages together, even though languages can be very, very different, the one thing they all have in common is that they are all building a very similar kind of hierarchical structure, and they're using very similar kinds of computational machinery to build that structure. Every language has sound patterns that can be computed with finite state machines that occupy sublevels of that regular region. All languages have structures that can be computed with finite state machines in the syntactic domain. And I think all languages are also going to contain at least a few structures that will require some memory in the form of push-down stack. So we have this common shared bed of computational machinery that's being used for this common purpose of generating sentences, generating words, generating valid strings and valid structures. And that's the thing that sort of ties all of us together. Okay, so I just want to go over some key concepts from this lecture. We talked about sound patterns of the world's languages. All languages have sound inventories, and they have rules for how they can put those sounds together into words. Turns out those rules are very simple. We talked about subregular structure. So that regular region of the complexity hierarchy actually further subdivides. And those patterns that we see in the world's languages about how to combine sounds into words turn out to be actually very simple. They're even just a subset of the computations that are contained within that regular region. We also talked about hierarchical structure and the importance of using hierarchical structure to model the way that we mentally represent sentences. The most important property that that hierarchical structure has is recursion, the fact that we can iterate a rule multiple times. We can take the output of a rule and loop it back as the input of that same rule. And that's what allows us to generate potentially infinitely long sentences and potentially infinitely many sentences. We talked about regular and context-free structures in the realm of syntax. That there's that common shared bed of computational machinery that we can use to process all of the structure that we see across the world's languages. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how human beings manage to acquire these rule sets. How do we actually learn languages? It seems like an insurmountable task. In a lot of ways, it kind of is. So it's a little bit of a mystery how children are able to do this so easily and so much more easily than we can as adults.